Thank you very much for being here and for inviting me to participate. It gives me great pleasure, actually, to be able to share some of these things with you as a kind of a sneak peek of what's to follow in the exhibition in Brussels, which will happen on the 4th of October to mark the inauguration of the Festival of Europalia. Europalia is biennial, it happens every 2 years, and it's headquartered in Brussels, but seems to have festivals that go around the rest of Belgium, sometimes into bordering regions as well. And at the Beaux-Arts Gallery, their lead festival this year is going to be on the thematic of the body. It, like Isabella said, forms a foundational way for people who are not acquainted with India to, on the one hand, approach India, but for those of us who are acquainted with India, to be able to try and find some method in the madness and trying to see the various and very plural ways of approaching the subject of the body. It's one thing to try and organize an exhibition which celebrates the body, looking at it outwardly. It's another thing to try and create an exhibition which looks at the value systems that inhere within the perception of the body. Even in terms of visual art, the thematic of the body itself has met with such resistance in India. Are we people who want to represent the body, or are we people who are opposed to the very representation of the body at all? Is a debate which has ensued for so many centuries within India that finding any way of being able to find a method through the galleries for this exhibition has proved to be extremely challenging. So the exhibition really has a subtext, which is that it tries to take us beyond the limits of form, not looking only at the idea of the physicality of the body. The exhibition is rather spectacular because not for 30 years now has there been an opportunity to be able to borrow artworks from so many museums all over the world, particularly from tiny little provincial site museums across India. This has been a great joy to be able to go to little museums all over Odisha, Andhra Pradesh, Tamil Nadu, Karnataka, parts of Himachal, to be able to source objects, to get into the reserved collections of some of the great national museums of India, like, for instance, Allahabad and Madras and Calcutta, has been very difficult and been extremely rewarding to find pieces that haven't actually been seen by the public since the 1920s when they were housed in those institutions. So pulling those things out has been quite rewarding. The exhibition has also allowed one to get into certain archives. My main interest has been to try and get to those institutions which have been asset rich but haven't been able to find ways of disseminating that information amongst other Indians or find a platform to be able to share their assets. So, for instance, going into the Rampur Raza library and pulling out certain rare manuscripts of the Mughals has been an extremely rewarding exercise, as you will just see. So how does one actually tend to present this exhibition? Well, the guiding principles have been to see what inheres within the body and to question what drives Indian bodies. Where do society's archetypes of heroism and valor rest, for example? What motivates abstinence or asceticism? How does a civilization view the rites of passage, death, birth? To what extent do Indians believe that the body's fate is destined or predetermined? And to what extent is fortune in the hands of those who shape it for themselves? Common enough universal concerns, but how have the ancients dealt with these questions? Are these questions new to the modern secular nation, or were these questions debated even in antiquity? And what was the nature of the engagement of the debates on these questions in antiquity is really what the focus of my exhibition is, which is largely deriving out of classical Indian art rather than modern and contemporary material. But in each gallery, one is trying to include at least one contemporary artwork, either as an interrogator of India's past or as something which sees a continuity with traditions. Enough has been written about how the modern and contemporary cannot be studied in lines of continuity, and I thought that that isn't really true, because modern and contemporary Indian art does have many of the same guiding principles. So it is good to include it. And to the extent that it marks a break and a rupture, and it marks a point of interrogation, there too it becomes a valuable way to be able to see the two traditions in dialogue. That is a sculpture of an Apsara from the Hoysala period, from the 12th century in Karnataka, which is in the National Museum. Indian systems of thought are inseparable from how they have thought about the body, and this exhibition aims to present 8 fundamental ways the body has been thought about in India. These 8 ways take us not so much into the corporeal physicality of the body, but into what is inherent within the body, as I was saying. And these are, we begin with the idea, as Isabella just said, that the time when the body comes into the news is when it's no longer filled with any spirit. And we begin, like with any great Puran, you start the story with the idea of death. Of course, it's a very well-established trope, even in psychoanalysis, to begin with the idea that we are all aware of our corporeality and our impending death. So we begin the exhibition with the idea of death. And that is a fantastic sculpture of Bhairav from a site called Ladol in Gujarat. It's made of a roughly hewn marble, and the skin is decomposing around the skeleton of Bhairav as he walks a cremation ground holding a skull cap in his hand. It's about 5 feet high and has been a great object to find for the exhibition. But as I was saying, this also posits a dialogue with the contemporary. This is a sculpture made by Alvar Balasubramaniam, where he is in dialogue with his disintegrating self. His body, he made 2 self-portraits, one out of sand and the other out of camphor. As I was saying, India's had this tremendous resistance to the very idea of the body. And many terms proliferate. Nirgun, Arup, Nirakar being 3 of the most dominant traditions. Now, rather than looking just at Islamic proscriptions on the representation of the body, there are also equally Buddhist and Hindu proscriptions, Brahmanical ones on the representation of the body. What the exhibition is trying to do is look at what are the solutions that different ages have proffered to the very idea of the representation in art of the body. So that's what this looks at, where the frame is alive, but the interior is the void, as you can see in this wonderful sculpture. I don't have time to dwell on some of the other great masterpieces that are going to be in this gallery, but the idea of the sanctum of Chidambaram, which has the empty void, the idea of the Aranamul mirrors, which have the idea of reflection, the ideas of the Akasha Purusha with the empty figure, the Siddhayantra, as it is called in Jain traditions. I mean, those are things which are going to be in this. Talismanic representations are going to be there. We have a fantastic metallic inlaid thing that was found in one of the museums in India, which belongs to Aurangzeb and the Mughal emperor, which has the 99 names of Allah in different scripts, which is going to be a part of this gathering. And of course, the most remarkable thing has been an entire group of Qadam Rasuls, footprints of the Prophet Muhammad, which have been found in mosques in various parts of India that are being put into this gallery. So that's going to be something to look forward to. It takes us to the next gallery, which is about the idea of birth and rebirth. And we look at the very idea of conception. The safeguarding of fetuses seems to be a very important preoccupation with Indian goddesses. And what is the nature of these very dangerous goddesses that can both cause miscarriage as well as protect fetuses? is what we explore in this gallery, along with the idea of the very fundamentals of the idea of creation in Indian thought, which takes us to the way India thinks about the fundamental idea of desire. And it is in this context that we examine how desire and karma are in an inextricable link. Idea certainly that I can't talk about here, but I can show you one of the great masterpieces that's going to be, I've just received confirmation, is going to be in the show, is this very early shivling. There are two very early shivlings known in India. One is the shivling of Gudimallam, which is near Tirupati, which is dated to the same time as this one, 2nd century BC, 2nd to 1st centuries BC. And this one, which was in northern India, found in a village called Aghapur near Bharatpur. And it's been lying in the Bharatpur Museum, largely unpublished, and it's going to be in the show. The matrikas, the mothers, as we were saying, are dangerous protectors. And I think one of the finest pieces that we can find is this one from the Kannauj Museum. The Kannauj Museum is about scarcely the size of this room, and one of the masterpieces in there is this very beautiful 8th century Pratihara sculpture of the mothers. Only 4 of the 7 mothers survive. But little things, do note little details about how the little figures supporting the larger ones. And each one is a compositional marvel. Of course, the ferocity of the mother goddess comes across nowhere more clearly than with Chamunda. And this particular Chamunda lying in Bhubaneswar comes from Jajpur and is dated to the 8th century. And those are some details of her flaming body bursting into, just consumed by fire. Her skin withering off her as she holds a twisting, revolving skull in her hand, which is spinning. The idea of motion is so implicit in these sculptures. And as you look below, there are carrion, including hyenas and rats and other creatures, feasting on the decimated corpses that lie below her. That's a dancing figure at the cremation ground. Just a tiny detail. The sculpture is filled with lots of these little details. The third gallery deals with issues of destiny, man and the cosmos. And the great discovery here was the 1580 Book of Spells and Zodiac, painted for the Mughal Emperor Akbar, that has been lying in the Rampur Raza Library and remains unpublished. And these magical spells deal with extraordinary pictorial devices, which seems to be some kind of a holy grail for the decipherment of the development of Mughal style. Trapped somewhere between the Tuti Nama and the Hamza Nama, this is very similar to the very early kind of Mughal aesthetic, and it has a lot of parallels with a group of paintings called the Fal Nama, which was made in Iran, and it seems to be very closely related to that. So here I'm showing you details of Virgo, for instance, the page dedicated to Virgo. But what is interesting is that apart from that, there are also magical spells, like the ones you see on the right. So there are magical spells for the Capricorn man, for the Capricorn woman, for the Piscean, and so on. And these are visual spells that the person must look at to be able to get certain profits in their life. The next gallery takes us to the idea of the supernatural body. And we look within supernaturalism at two concerns. In each gallery, in fact, my concern, one guiding principle has been to look at scripture and classical art at one level, but also to try and look at all of this art from the level of every man. So in the Death Gallery, one is equally concerned not just with classical scripture, but also looking at memorial stones, sati stones, personal biographies of individual people in each gallery. Similarly, in the Birth Gallery, we're looking at talismans that people actually wore on their bodies to have a safe term of pregnancy or to be able to protect the newborn. In the gallery on astrology and cosmology, we look at individual horoscopes in relation to the idea of wider civilizational notions about cosmology. In the idea of the supernatural, when we look at the supernatural bodies of the gods, it begs the questions to who would have had access to these bodies. What is the status of the artist who makes those bodies? What is the status of the low caste person who's not permitted into the temple to see those bodies? And what do you see instead? What are the other bodies that survive? So it's not trying to present a view of India which is oblivious to the fact that these notions are there to be questioned. And that's what one tries to do. This particular statue of Rama, a Chola bronze, was lying in the Vaishnav storeroom. The Madras Museum, incidentally, has divided its bronzes into Vaishnav, Shaiva, and other. And this is in the Vaishnav storeroom. Hopefully, by the time it comes to the exhibition, we'll have better, more seductive pictures of it. Right now, you can see how it's housed and where it is. Now, alongside the sculptures of the gods, the idea of the supernatural also explores the idea of other bodies, bodies of marginalized and other traditions that were either suppressed or co-opted into classical religions. Here, the world of the supernatural beings like demons, yakshas, yakshinis, nagas, they become relevant. This particular sculpture, unpublished, has of a naga or a serpent. The entire body of the sculpture is covered with snake scales. The sculptor has carved scales across the entire body, and that's quite charming to see. Heroism marks the next gallery, the sixth gallery. What constitutes the idea of the heroic body? And what constitutes the idea of the heroic body in a gendered perspective? A male hero versus a female hero. What are the demarcators for the heroes when they are men and versus women? And here, the sacrificial nature of a woman or the maternal nature of a woman is what tends to get celebrated. And here you see a Mughal painting of Sita in the being tested by fire from the Ramayana. Very demurely covering her face, still in parda even while she's in the fire. That's from the Bharat Kala Bhavan in Varanasi. Similarly, ideals of kingship, we have paintings from the Babarnama that are coming to the exhibition, including this, which is never been published in color before, showing Babur watching a wrestling match, as very much like a Hindu king seated in Lalitasana as he watches it. The seventh gallery takes us to the idea of asceticism. And this sculpture, a very unusual Chola bronze, showing Manika Vachaka, South Indian Tamil saint, shows him devoid of all the supernaturalism that we usually associate with Indian sculpture. Now, the ascetic body really allows us to explore the corporeal body, the idea of nudity, the idea of gender, the idea of questioning caste, which happens in India's ascetical traditions. So that's what this gallery really does. It, of course, lends itself to the ideas of the Sufis as well. It takes the idea backward to the idea of the great rishis, the seers, who are supposed to have given ideas of which have guided Indian civilization. And the Shaivite system is the Pashupata Shaivite system comes out of a particular seer called Lakulisha. And this particular statue of Lakulisha is perhaps the most remarkable in India because it shows him, I'm sorry the slide isn't very clear, but it shows him with two phalluses rather than one. And is one of the great masterpieces of the Bhopal Museum. I will skip the video, but there is a tradition which deals equally with the idea of militant asceticism in India. And that's what we end the gallery on asceticism with, that asceticism is not just some pure space of yoga and transcendence, but is equally concerned with ideas of training the physicality of the body. So from the 10th century onward, 8th century onward, we have a large number of mutts in central India for Shaivite militant ascetics, which eventually grow into the idea of the militant ascetical traditions of the Khalsa in Sikh asceticism. So that's what that gallery deals with. The last gallery, finally, deals with the idea of rapture, the body in art, and how asceticism and art both allow for a condition which calls for the loss of the physicality of the body and for for the person to be one with the work of art, to the degree of empathy being such that you have a unified experience with the work of art. That constitutes the last gallery. And rapture then allows one to look at, of course, clearly the issues of Shiva, which is paramount. I shan't, because of the needs of time, talk about some of the other details in this gallery. But of course, it's about a kind of celebration of the body in dance. It's about a celebration of the body in love. Krishna dresses as Radha, Radha dresses as Krishna. They become each other, on the one hand. Or they get cloaked together in rapture, in a unified experience, both as transcendental lovers, covered eternally in lotuses.